The air was thick with laughter and music, the kind of carefully curated atmosphere that masks the undercurrent of office politics and personal ambitions. I hadn't planned to be here tonight, but something in me couldn't resist. It wasn't suspicion exactly, just a nagging unease that had been growing for weeks. Emily had insisted I skip the company gala, brushing it off as a boring obligation. But the distant way she said it, coupled with her sudden interest in late-night work meetings and uncharacteristic secrecy, had me second-guessing. As I pushed through the heavy double doors of the ballroom, the wave of sound and light hit me. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting off the polished floors and the glinting glasses of champagne. My eyes darted through the sea of familiar faces. I was here unannounced, not as an invited guest, but as a husband who had once trusted without question. And then I saw her. She stood near the bar, her posture relaxed but charged with an energy I hadn't seen in months. She was laughing, her head tilted just so, the light catching her hair in a way that had always captivated me. But tonight, it felt different. It wasn't her laughter that drew me in. It was the man standing too close, his body angled toward hers, leaning in as though they shared a secret the rest of the world wasn't meant to know. He touched her arm lightly, a gesture so casual it might have been innocent. Except it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I could feel it in my gut. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him ever so slightly, her smile growing warmer. I froze in place, my hand still gripping the strap of my coat. The world around me blurred, and all I could see was the two of them. My mind raced through excuses, searching for any explanation that would make this scene something other than what it appeared to be. A colleague, maybe? A friend? But none of those possibilities could justify the intimate ease between them. Someone jostled my shoulder, muttering an apology, and I took a step back, blending into the shadows of the room. I didn't approach her. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was seeing before I acted. My stomach churned as I watched her laugh at something he said, her hand brushing his sleeve as she turned slightly toward him. And then the lights dimmed. The room shifted, and the crowd turned their attention to the massive screen at the front of the hall. The master of ceremonies began speaking, his voice booming over the speakers, announcing a video tribute to the company's year of achievements. Applause filled the air as the first image appeared, a montage of smiling employees, bustling offices, and team outings. I tried to focus on the screen, but my attention kept drifting back to the corner where Emily stood. She was still there, her body language unchanged, the man beside her murmuring something into her ear. I wanted to storm over, to demand answers, but before I could summon the courage, the tone of the video shifted. The images on the screen turned from corporate highlights to something more personal. The music softened, and the montage showcased employees enjoying themselves outside of work. Team dinners, charity events, holiday parties. I almost dismissed it as another mundane sequence, until her face appeared. Emily. She was laughing, but not with me. The footage was grainy, handheld, and unmistakably intimate. She sat across from the same man at a dimly lit table, her hand wrapped around a glass of wine. He poured her another, his fingers brushing hers under the table. The camera lingered on their smiles, the kind that said they shared more than just a meal. The room fell silent. At first, there was only stunned disbelief. Then came the murmurs, the whispers that rippled through the crowd like a wave. I stood there, my chest tight, my hands trembling as I watched the scene unfold. More clips followed, quick flashes of moments I wasn't meant to see. Him touching her cheek, her leaning in close, a kiss stolen at the end of a night. The final image froze on the screen. The two of them, hands entwined, laughing in a place I didn't recognize. The applause had long since died out, replaced by the kind of heavy silence that holds the weight of 100 unspoken judgments. My ears rang, my vision blurred, and my world shattered. I turned my gaze to the corner of the room where she stood. Emily was no longer laughing. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with panic as they scanned the crowd. And then she saw me. Our eyes locked, and in that instant, I saw everything. fear, guilt, and the dawning realization that there was no hiding from this. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. The man beside her reached out, but she shoved him away in a desperate motion, her lips moving as though to form words that wouldn't come. I stood rooted to the spot, the enormity of her betrayal unfolding in front of an audience that had once celebrated her. This wasn't just infidelity. This was humiliation, laid bare for all to see. Every moment of trust, every memory we had built together, now lay broken at my feet. I didn't know what to do. Walk out and let her face the fallout alone? Confront her here in front of everyone and add to the spectacle? My heart raced, my thoughts spinning, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. I left the gala without a word, my head spinning, my chest hollow. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I stumbled to my car. I gripped the steering wheel, struggling to breathe, trying to process what I had just seen. The images of Emily with that man replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Her laughter, his touch, the kiss. By the time I got home, the weight of it all had settled in, crushing me. I sat in the darkened living room, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the floor. The silence was suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to turn on the TV or the radio. I didn't want to drown out the thoughts. I wanted answers. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the stillness. I stared at it, her name lighting up the screen. I let it ring. A voicemail followed, her voice shaky, pleading for me to call her back. Another buzz, a text this time, followed by another. I couldn't bring myself to look at them. Not yet. I needed to think, to gather myself, to figure out what to do next. The next morning, I woke to find more missed calls and messages from Emily. I ignored them all. Instead, I focused on the one thing that might give me clarity: evidence. If what I saw was just the surface, I needed to know how deep this betrayal went. I had ignored the signs for too long, dismissed her late nights, her distant demeanor, the evasive answers. No more. I started with her social media. Her posts were curated and polished, each one portraying a perfect life. Our life. But as I scrolled through, something felt off. The captions were shorter, the photos less frequent. And the pictures of us together? They had stopped months ago. Instead, there were group photos from work events, carefully cropped and filtered. Nothing incriminating, but the absence of us was damning in itself. Her laptop was next. I had never been one to invade her privacy, but tonight I made an exception. Her password was the same one she had used for years. Familiarity cut deeper than I expected as I typed it in and watched the screen unlock. The desktop was neat, with folders labeled work and personal. I opened the work folder first, sifting through spreadsheets, presentations, and documents. Nothing unusual. It was in her email that I found it. The subject lines jumped out at me immediately: dinners, weekends, travel plans, all with his name attached. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the mouse, my stomach twisting. I clicked on one, and my worst fears were confirmed. It wasn't just casual. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a relationship. The messages were casual, flirtatious, and loaded with undertones that made my blood boil. He called her pet names, spoke of moments they'd shared, planned more meetings under the guise of work. She responded with equal enthusiasm, her words betraying the woman I thought I knew. I saved the emails, forwarding them to myself as I went. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with them, but I knew I needed them. Evidence, I told myself. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the distance growing between us. The final blow came when I found the folder hidden within her personal files. It was labeled travel, innocuous enough. But when I opened it, my heart sank. Photos of the two of them stared back at me, frozen moments of intimacy I was never meant to see. A weekend getaway in the mountains, a dinner at a restaurant she'd once promised we'd try together, smiling selfies at a park I didn't recognize. I stared at the screen, numb, my hands shaking. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't a mistake. This was a second life, built on secrets and lies. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave, pulling me under and leaving me gasping for air. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, my head spinning. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had erased me from her life, replaced me with someone else. As the day wore on, I struggled to decide what to do. Confront her? Wait for her to come clean? Pack my things and leave without a word? Every option felt wrong, yet every moment of inaction felt unbearable. When her car pulled into the driveway that evening, I felt my heart race. She entered the house cautiously, her footsteps hesitant. Her eyes met mine, filled with guilt and fear. She started to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush, but I held up my hand, silencing her. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses. Not yet. Not when the truth was already written in black and white, staring back at me from the screen. I left the room without a word, retreating to the guest bedroom. The door closed behind me with a finality that echoed through the house. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. I didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain: whatever we had was gone. The night was still, but inside me, everything churned with a mix of anger, sadness, and anticipation. I had spent hours replaying the evidence in my mind, each photo and email carving deeper wounds into my already battered heart. The weight of it all was unbearable, and I knew it was time. Time to confront her. She sat on the couch in the living room, her posture tense, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence between us stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine as I entered the room, and I saw the fear there, the guilt she was no longer able to hide. I stood across from her, gripping the back of the armchair for support, as though the weight of what I was about to say might send me crashing to the ground. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words felt trapped, lodged in my throat behind the storm of emotions raging inside me. She broke the silence first, her voice soft, shaky, almost pleading. "I'm sorry," she said, but the words felt hollow. They bounced off the walls, meaningless against the backdrop of what she had done. I asked her to explain. Why him? Why now? Why had she turned to someone else instead of coming to me, instead of trying to fix whatever was broken between us? My voice trembled with a mix of anger and heartbreak as I demanded answers, demanded the truth she had been hiding for months. Her words came in fragments, broken and disjointed, as though she couldn't quite bring herself to admit what we both already knew. "It wasn't planned," she said. "It just happened." She felt neglected, lonely, unappreciated. It was all the usual excuses, the justifications that did nothing to lessen the blow. I told her I had seen the photos, read the emails, watched the video at the gala. Her face crumpled, her hands flying to her mouth as if she could stop the weight of her guilt from spilling out. Tears streamed down her face, and she reached out to me, but I stepped back, the distance between us growing even in that small motion. I demanded to know how long it had been going on. Her voice cracked as she admitted it had been months. Months of stolen moments, hidden messages, lies told with practiced ease. The realization made me feel sick, my stomach twisting as I tried to comprehend the scope of her betrayal. When I asked if she loved him, she froze. Her silence was answer enough. The room felt colder, the walls closing in as I tried to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I had thought I knew. The one I had trusted, built a life with, planned a future alongside. I reminded her of the promises we had made to each other, of the life we had built together. I spoke of the nights we stayed up talking about our dreams, of the sacrifices we had made to support each other. How could she throw it all away for a fleeting connection, for someone who hadn't shared her struggles, her joys, her victories? Her tears came harder now, her voice trembling as she insisted she still loved me, that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, and that she regretted it more than anything. But her words felt like ash in my ears, meaningless against the mountain of evidence that told a different story. I asked her what she wanted. Did she want to leave, to start a new life with him? Or did she want to stay and try to rebuild what was left of us? The question hung in the air, unanswered. She looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, as though searching for some sign of forgiveness, some hint that I might be willing to let this go. But I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't make decisions in the heat of the moment. The pain was too fresh, the betrayal too raw. I left her sitting there, her sobs echoing through the house as I climbed the stairs to the guest room. Lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The memories of us, good and bad, flashed through my mind, a cruel montage of what we had been and what we had lost. Sleep didn't come that night, only the haunting question of where we went from here. The confrontation was over, but the fight for what remained of our lives together was just beginning. The days that followed felt like moving through a fog. Every step, every breath was heavy, weighed down by the unbearable truth that had been unearthed. Emily and I moved around each other like strangers in the same house, the air between us thick with silence and unspoken words. The once comfortable rhythm of our life together was gone, replaced by an oppressive tension that neither of us dared to address. Friends and family began to notice something was wrong. We were no longer the easy, affectionate couple everyone admired. Emily had always been the more social of the two of us, and now her absence at gatherings raised questions. When people asked why she wasn't there, I deflected with vague excuses about her being busy with work or not feeling well. I couldn't bring myself to admit the truth. Not yet. The humiliation of saying it out loud felt too much to bear. At work, I tried to focus, but my mind was constantly elsewhere. My colleagues asked if I was okay, their concern evident, but I waved them off with forced smiles and reassurances that I was just tired. It was easier to pretend than to explain. The truth felt too raw, too personal, and sharing it felt like cutting open a wound that was already bleeding. At home, Emily tried to make amends in her own way. She left handwritten notes apologizing, her words dripping with remorse, promising to do whatever it took to fix what she had broken. She made an effort to be around more, to cook dinners we used to enjoy together, to engage in the little routines we had once cherished. But each gesture felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to patch a sinking ship with tissue paper. I couldn't bring myself to accept her attempts at normalcy. Every time I looked at her, I saw him, the man who had taken what wasn't his to take. The images of them together, the laughter, the intimacy, haunted me like a recurring nightmare I couldn't wake from. I wanted to scream at her, to demand why I wasn't enough, but the anger felt like a fire that would consume me entirely if I let it out. One evening, as I sat in the darkened living room nursing a glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed. A friend texted, asking if I had seen the video from the gala circulating online. My heart sank. I hadn't even considered that possibility, that someone might have recorded the mortifying moment when the truth about Emily's betrayal was splashed across the screen for everyone to see. Panic set in as I searched social media, my hands trembling as I scrolled. And there was a short clip taken by someone in the audience. The video captured the moment her face appeared on the screen, followed by the damning footage of her and the man. The comments were a mix of shock, pity, and judgment, each one a dagger to my already fragile sense of self. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't thought possible. It wasn't just my pain anymore, it was a public spectacle. People I barely knew now had front-row seats to the unraveling of my marriage. The humiliation was unbearable, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Emily must have seen the video too. The next morning, she approached me cautiously, her face pale and drawn, her eyes pleading. She asked if I had seen it, her voice trembling. I nodded, saying nothing, my silence heavier than any words could be. She apologized again, her tears spilling freely, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. How could I? She had brought this upon herself and upon us. The whispers began to spread among our circle of friends. Invitations dried up, conversations became stilted, and I could feel the weight of their pity every time I saw them. They didn't say it outright, but their carefully worded questions and lingering glances spoke volumes. They wondered if I would leave her, if I could forgive her, if I could survive the storm she had unleashed. Emily withdrew further, the guilt and shame seeming to consume her. She stayed home more often, avoiding the outside world, retreating into a shell I had never seen before. She wasn't the confident, vibrant woman I had fallen in love with. She was a shadow of herself, haunted by the consequences of her choices. And yet, even as I watched her crumble, I felt no satisfaction. There was no vindication in seeing her suffer. It only added to the weight of my own pain, the endless loop of questions I couldn't stop asking. What had I done wrong? Was there something I could have done differently? Was this my fault? The ripple effects of her betrayal touched every aspect of my life. Friends distanced themselves, unsure how to navigate the minefield of my emotions. My family was hesitant to reach out, afraid of saying the wrong thing. And I, once so sure of who I was and the life I had built, now felt like a stranger in my own skin. The fallout was far-reaching, a reminder that betrayal doesn't just break hearts, it breaks entire worlds. And as I sat alone, staring at the pieces of what was once my life, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The house had become a mausoleum of memories. Every room, every piece of furniture seemed to mock me with the echoes of what used to be. The kitchen table where we shared morning coffee, the couch where we curled up for movie nights, even the bedroom that now felt more like a battlefield than a sanctuary. It all reminded me of a life that had been shattered. I couldn't stay here much longer. I needed clarity, a way to navigate the chaos that had engulfed my life. That's when I decided to meet with a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision. A part of me still clung to the hope that this was salvageable, that time might dull the pain and allow us to rebuild. But another part of me, the part growing stronger with each passing day, knew I needed to protect myself. I needed to take control. The lawyer's office was sterile, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and faint traces of coffee. I sat across from a man who had seen countless stories like mine, his expression a careful mix of professionalism and compassion. I laid it all out, the betrayal, the evidence, the public humiliation, and he listened without interrupting. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and told me I had options. Divorce was, of course, the most definitive route. He explained the division of assets, the possibility of alimony, and the legal process that would follow. But he also spoke of separation, a less permanent step that would give me space to decide if reconciliation was truly impossible. I left the office with a folder of papers and a heavy heart. The thought of ending our marriage, of dismantling the life we had built together, was overwhelming. But so was the idea of staying, of living with the constant reminder of her betrayal. It felt like a no-win situation, a choice between two kinds of pain. Emily noticed the folder when I came home, her eyes flicking to it and then back to me. She didn't ask about it, but her silence spoke volumes. The tension in the house had become unbearable, every interaction fraught with unspoken questions and unaddressed wounds. I couldn't stay here, not like this. That evening, I packed a bag. Not much, just enough to get me through a few days. As I zipped it shut, Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She begged me not to leave, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. She promised to change, to do whatever it took to fix what she had broken. I told her I needed time to think, to breathe, to figure out who I was without her. She tried to argue, but I held firm. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about saving myself. I couldn't heal while surrounded by the ruins of what we had been. I left the house that night, the sound of her quiet sobs following me as I closed the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets blurring past as I tried to process everything. Eventually, I checked into a small hotel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The first few days were hard. I woke up each morning expecting to see her beside me, only to be met with the cold emptiness of the unfamiliar room. I missed her, despite everything. I missed the way she used to smile at me, the way her laughter could fill a room, the way she made me feel like I was the center of her world. But I couldn't ignore the truth. She had shattered that world, and no amount of missing her could change that. I threw myself into rebuilding. I found a therapist, someone who could help me untangle the mess of emotions I was carrying. I started going to the gym again, rediscovering the small joys of pushing my body to its limits. I reconnected with friends I had lost touch with, finding solace in their support and understanding. Through it all, I kept my distance from Emily. She called and texted, her messages alternating between apologies and pleas for another chance. I read them, but I rarely responded. I wasn't ready. I didn't know if I ever would be. Slowly, I began to find my footing. I started envisioning a future that didn't include her, a life where I could be whole again. It wasn't easy, and the pain didn't disappear overnight. But day by day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of my hotel room, I picked up the divorce papers the lawyer had given me. I stared at them for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. It wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about letting go of the dreams we had shared, the life we had built together. But as I signed my name at the bottom of the page, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step forward, a way to reclaim my life and start anew. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving, however slowly, toward a future that was mine to create. The divorce papers sat on the corner of my desk, sealed in an envelope that felt heavier than it should. Sending them off wasn't a celebration or a victory. It was an acknowledgement of what I'd lost and a step towards something unknown. I dropped them in the mail without ceremony, the cold reality sinking in as the envelope disappeared into the slot. It was done. The process had begun. Emily's reaction was immediate. Her messages shifted from apologies to desperation, her words laced with panic and regret. She begged to meet, to talk, to explain herself yet again. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The love we had shared, the trust, the dreams, the future was gone. And no amount of words could bring it back. For weeks, I poured myself into rebuilding. I moved into a small but comfortable apartment across town, a space that felt entirely my own. There were no shared memories here, no echoes of a life that no longer existed. The clean slate was both comforting and unsettling, a constant reminder of the life I was now living on my own terms. Work became my refuge. The routine, the focus, the deadlines, all of it gave me purpose and distracted me from the emptiness that lingered in the quieter moments. My colleagues seemed to sense the shift in me. They didn't pry, but their small gestures, an extra coffee left on my desk, a shared joke during meetings, were enough to remind me that I wasn't entirely alone. I started to find myself again in unexpected ways. I picked up hobbies I hadn't touched in years, painting, hiking, even cooking meals that didn't involve the microwave. Each small act felt like a reclamation, a piece of me returning to the surface after being buried for so long. I began to feel the faint stirrings of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. But healing wasn't linear. There were nights when the loneliness was suffocating, when the weight of everything I had lost pressed down on me like a boulder. I missed the familiarity of her presence, the way she hummed to herself while cooking, the scent of her shampoo on the pillow. I missed the version of her I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with. One evening, while sorting through a box of old photographs, I found a picture of us from the early years of our marriage. We were smiling, carefree, our arms wrapped around each other as though the world couldn't touch us. My heart ached as I stared at the image, wondering how we had gone from that moment to this. But as painful as it was to reflect on what had been, it also reminded me of what I deserved. Love built on trust, a partner who valued loyalty as much as I did, a life where betrayal wasn't an inevitability but a distant fear. I wasn't there yet, but I knew I was moving closer to it with every passing day. Emily tried to see me a few times. Once, she showed up at my apartment unannounced, her eyes red and pleading as she begged me to let her in. I stood in the doorway, my hand gripping the frame for support as I told her firmly that I needed space. She cried, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to convince me that we could rebuild, that she could be the woman I deserved. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out and wipe her tears away, to tell her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with promises alone. It had been shattered, and while she might be willing to pick up the pieces, I wasn't sure I could ever see them as whole again. In the months that followed, I began to feel a shift within myself. The anger that had burned so brightly began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I was learning to live with it, to let it be a part of my story without defining me. One day, while hiking a trail I hadn't visited in years, I stopped at a clearing overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting everything in a golden light that made the world feel new. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly present. The journey wasn't over. There were still moments of doubt, still nights when the silence was too loud. But as I stood in that clearing, I realized something important. I had survived. I had taken the first, painful steps toward a life that was entirely my own. And while the future was uncertain, it was mine to shape. I headed back down the trail as the sky deepened into twilight, a small smile tugging at my lips. This was a new beginning, not just for my life, but for me. And for the first time, I was ready to embrace it. The months stretched into a year, and with time came clarity. The sharp edges of my heartbreak dulled, no longer slicing into me with every passing thought of Emily. Life had settled into a rhythm. Work, friendships, hobbies, all woven together with a quiet sense of self-discovery. I wasn't the same person I had been, and I was okay with that. Pain had reshaped me, but it hadn't destroyed me. It had taught me resilience. One rainy afternoon, as I sat in my favorite cafe flipping through a book, I saw her. Emily walked in, shaking raindrops from her coat, her eyes scanning the room. For a moment, I froze. I hadn't seen her since the day she showed up at my apartment. She looked different, her hair shorter, her posture more guarded, but the sight of her didn't ignite the anger or sadness I'd once carried. Instead, I felt a quiet curiosity, a distant nostalgia. She spotted me and hesitated, her expression shifting from surprise to uncertainty. I gave a small nod, an unspoken invitation. She made her way over, and as she sat across from me, I noticed how time had softened her, just as it had softened me. We exchanged pleasantries, our words cautious but civil. She asked how I was doing, and I told her about my new apartment, my growing passion for hiking, and how I'd reconnected with old friends. She smiled, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or longing for what once was. She told me about her life, about how she had started therapy and was focusing on herself. She admitted she was still piecing things together, learning how to live with the choices she had made. Her voice wavered as she said she was sorry again, not just for what she had done, but for the pain she had caused. This time her apology felt different. It felt genuine. I nodded, letting her words sink in. For so long, I had replayed the betrayal in my mind, clung to the anger and the hurt as though they were my only connection to her. But sitting there, watching her struggle to find the right words, I realized something. I didn't need her apology to move on. I already had. I told her I forgave her. The words came easily, surprising even me. Forgiveness didn't mean I would forget, or that what she had done was okay. It meant I was ready to let go of the weight I had carried for so long. I was ready to free myself from the grip of the past. Her eyes welled with tears, and she thanked me softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. We sat in silence for a moment, the tension that had once defined our interactions replaced by something quieter, something closer to peace. As we parted ways, I watched her disappear into the rainy streets, her silhouette fading into the crowd. I didn't feel the ache I used to feel when I saw her leave. Instead, I felt light, as though a chapter of my life had finally been closed. That evening, I returned to my apartment and looked around the space I had built for myself. It wasn't much, a few plants by the window, a bookshelf filled with mismatched titles, a couch that creaked when I sat on it. But it was mine. It was a reflection of who I had become. Someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who had learned to stand on his own. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. It was a part of my story, a chapter that had shaped me but wouldn't control me. I thought about the future, not with dread, but with hope. There was still so much to discover, so many paths to explore. I poured myself a glass of wine, turned on some music, and let the evening settle around me. As the rain tapped against the window, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. This was my life now. Imperfect, uncertain, but beautifully mine. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss interesting life stories, and write a comment if you like the story. See you.